Pricing pipe work requires careful consideration of several factors. These include material costs, labor costs, overhead costs, and your desired profit margin. Material costs encompass the price of the pipe itself, all necessary fittings, and the wire that will be installed within the conduit. Labor costs are calculated based on your hourly rates for the electricians involved, the size of the crew required for the job, and your best estimate of the total installation time. Overhead costs represent your general business expenses, such as insurance premiums, rent for your office or shop space, and administrative costs associated with running your business. Finally, the profit margin is the percentage of return on investment that you aim to achieve on the project. There are several methods commonly used for pricing electrical work. One is pricing by the hourly rate, where you multiply your hourly rate by the estimated installation time. Another approach is pricing per foot, where you establish a fixed price for each foot of pipe installed, and this price includes both materials and labor. A third method is cost-plus pricing, where you add up the material costs, labor costs, overhead costs, and desired profit margin to arrive at the total project price. Let's consider two specific job scenarios. Firstly, there's a job involving 190 feet of 1/2-inch electrical metallic tubing and to be installed approximately 10 feet high, and this will house two 20-amp single-phase circuits. Secondly, there's a job involving 220 feet of 1-inch ENT to be installed to a height of 16 to 18 feet, and this will house a 50-amp three-phase circuit. For both of these jobs, a recommended pricing method is per foot pricing. For job 1, start by carefully estimating the material costs for the pipe fittings and wire required for the 190-foot run. Then determine your labor costs based on your hourly rate and your estimated installation time for this particular job. Don't forget to factor in your overhead costs and desired profit margin. Finally, calculate the total cost per foot, making sure to include all of these factors: materials, labor, overhead, and profit. For job 2, you will follow essentially the same steps as for job 1. However, it's crucial to consider the additional complexity and the increased height of the installation, which will likely impact your labor costs and potentially your material handling costs as well. Here are some additional tips to keep in mind when pricing pipe work. Firstly, always get accurate measurements. Ensure that you have precise measurements of the pipe runs to avoid underestimating or overestimating the costs of materials and labor. Secondly, consider access and any restrictions on the job site. Take into account any potential obstacles or access issues that may affect the installation time and the ease with which your crew can perform the work. Thirdly, be prepared to negotiate with clients. Pricing is often a point of discussion, so be prepared to negotiate based on factors such as the overall size of the project, the client's budget, and your own level of experience and expertise. Fourthly, always provide a detailed proposal to the client. Clearly outline the scope of work, the materials you'll be using, the estimated labor hours, and your pricing structure to avoid any misunderstandings or disputes later on. When estimating material costs, be sure to factor in not just the cost of the ENT conduit itself, but also the cost of all necessary fittings such as couplings, connectors, straps, and supports. Don't forget to include the cost of the wire that will be pulled through the conduit, as well as any boxes, enclosures, or other hardware required for the installation. When estimating labor costs, consider the time it will take to measure, cut, bend, and install the conduit, as well as the time required to pull the wire, make connections, and test the circuits. Take into account the complexity of the installation, the height at which the work will be performed, and any potential obstacles or challenges that may slow down the process. Remember to factor in the time it takes for setup and cleanup, as well as any travel time to and from the job site. When calculating your overhead costs, include all of your general business expenses, such as rent, utilities, insurance, vehicle expenses, and office supplies. You may also want to include a portion of your salary or wages as an owner or manager, as well as any expenses related to marketing, advertising, or professional development. When determining your profit margin, consider the level of risk involved in the project, the demand for your services, and the prevailing market rates for similar work in your area. A typical profit margin for electrical contractors can range from 10% to 20%, but this can vary depending on the specific circumstances of the job. When preparing your proposal, be sure to clearly state your assumptions and exclusions. For example, if your price does not include any trenching or excavation work, or if it assumes that the client will provide access to the job site during normal business hours, be sure to spell this out in your proposal. Also, be sure to include a payment schedule that outlines when you expect to be paid for your work. A common payment schedule is to require a deposit upfront, with progress payments due at certain milestones, and a final payment due upon completion of the project. It is important to understand how the National Electrical Code (NEC) impacts your pricing. The NEC sets standards for safe electrical installations, and compliance with the NEC is essential for any electrical project. Failing to comply with the NEC can result in fines, penalties, and even legal liability. The NEC covers a wide range of topics related to electrical installations, including wiring methods, overcurrent protection, grounding, and equipment installation. It is important to be familiar with the NEC requirements that apply to your specific project, and to factor in the cost of complying with these requirements when preparing your bid. For example, the NEC specifies minimum wire sizes for different ampacities, as well as requirements for conduit fill and box fill. These requirements can impact the amount of materials you need to purchase, as well as the amount of labor required to install the wiring. The NEC also has requirements for grounding and bonding, which are designed to protect people from electrical shock. These requirements can impact the type of grounding electrodes you need to install, as well as the way you bond metal enclosures and equipment. Furthermore, the NEC contains requirements for overcurrent protection, which are designed to protect electrical circuits from overload and short circuits. These requirements can impact the type of circuit breakers or fuses you need to install, as well as the size and type of conductors you need to use. In addition to the NEC, there may be other local codes or regulations that apply to your project. It is important to check with your local building department to determine what codes and regulations are in effect in your area, and to factor in the cost of complying with these requirements when preparing your bid. For example, some jurisdictions may require you to obtain a permit before starting any electrical work, and they may charge a fee for the permit. Other jurisdictions may have specific requirements for inspections, and they may charge a fee for the inspection. When pricing pipe work, it is important to consider the type of conduit you will be using. There are several different types of conduit available, each with its own advantages and disadvantages. EMT, or electrical metallic tubing, is a thin-walled steel conduit that is commonly used for indoor wiring. It is relatively inexpensive and easy to install, but it is not suitable for use in wet or corrosive environments. Rigid metal conduit, RMC, is a thick-walled steel conduit that is stronger and more durable than EMT. It is suitable for use in both indoor and outdoor applications, and it can be used in wet or corrosive environments. Intermediate metal conduit, IMC, is a type of steel conduit that is lighter than RMC but stronger than EMT. It is a good compromise between cost and durability, and it can be used in a variety of applications. PVC conduit is a type of plastic conduit that is lightweight, non-conductive, and resistant to corrosion. It is commonly used for underground wiring and for wiring in wet or corrosive environments. Flexible metal conduit is a type of flexible conduit that is used for connecting equipment that is subject to vibration or movement. It is also used in tight spaces where it is difficult to bend rigid conduit. The type of conduit you choose will depend on the specific requirements of your project as well as your budget. When pricing pipe work, it is important to consider the size of the conduit you will be using. The size of the conduit will depend on the number and size of the wires you need to run through it. The NEC specifies the maximum number of wires that can be installed in a conduit of a given size, and it is important to comply with these requirements to avoid overheating and other problems. The NEC provides tables that list the maximum number of wires that can be installed in different sizes of conduit. These tables take into account the size of the wires, the type of insulation, and the type of conduit. When sizing conduit, it is important to consider not only the number of wires you need to run, but also the future needs of the installation. It is often a good idea to install a larger conduit than is strictly necessary to allow for future expansion. This can save you time and money in the long run, as you will not have to replace the conduit if you need to add more wires later on. When pricing pipework, it is important to consider the type of fittings you will be using. There are many different types of fittings available, each designed for a specific purpose. Couplings are used to connect two pieces of conduit together. Connectors are used to connect conduit to boxes or enclosures. Elbows are used to change the direction of a conduit run. Straps are used to support conduit. Bushings are used to protect wires from abrasion as they enter or exit conduit. The type of fittings you choose will depend on the specific requirements of your project as well as your budget. When pricing pipework, it is important to consider the type of wire you will be using. There are many different types of wire available, each with its own advantages and disadvantages. THHN wire is a type of thermoplastic high heat resistant nylon coated wire that is commonly used for general purpose wiring. It is relatively inexpensive and easy to install, but it is not suitable for use in wet or corrosive environments. THWN wire is a type of thermoplastic heat and water resistant nylon coated wire that is suitable for use in wet or dry locations. It is more expensive than THHN wire, but it is more versatile. XHHW wire is a type of cross-linked polyethylene high heat and water resistant wire that is suitable for use in wet or dry locations. It has a higher temperature rating than THHN or THWN wire, and it is more resistant to abrasion and chemicals. The type of wire you choose will depend on the specific requirements of your project, as well as your budget. When pricing pipework, it is important to consider the labor costs involved in installing the conduit, fittings, and wire. Labor costs will vary depending on the complexity of the installation, the height at which the work is being performed, and the skill level of the electricians. It is important to accurately estimate the labor costs to avoid underbidding or overbidding the project. When estimating labor costs, it is important to consider the time it will take to measure, cut, bend, and install the conduit. It is also important to consider the time it will take to pull the wire through the conduit, make connections, and test the circuits. The NEC requires that all electrical work be performed by qualified electricians, and it is important to hire electricians who are properly trained and licensed. Hiring unqualified electricians can result in poor workmanship, safety hazards, and code violations. In addition to the direct labor costs, it is important to consider the indirect labor costs, such as the cost of workers' compensation insurance, payroll taxes, and employee benefits. These costs can add a significant amount to the overall labor costs of the project. When pricing pipe work, it is important to consider the overhead costs associated with running your business. Overhead costs include rent, utilities, insurance, vehicle expenses, office supplies, and other expenses that are not directly related to a specific project. It is important to accurately estimate your overhead costs and to include them in your bid to ensure that you are making a profit in the project. There are several different ways to allocate overhead costs to individual projects. One common method is to allocate overhead costs as a percentage of direct labor costs. For example, if your overhead costs are 20% of your direct labor costs, you would add 20% to your direct labor costs to cover your overhead expenses. Another method is to allocate overhead costs as a percentage of total project costs. For example, if your overhead costs are 10% of your total project costs, you would add 10% to your total project costs to cover your overhead expenses. When pricing pipework, it is important to consider your desired profit margin. Your profit margin is the percentage of revenue that you want to keep after paying all of your expenses. The profit margin will vary depending on the type of project, the level of risk involved, and the market conditions. It is important to set a profit margin that is high enough to cover your expenses and to provide you with a reasonable return on your investment. There are several different ways to calculate your profit margin. One common method is to calculate your profit margin as a percentage of revenue. For example, if you want to make a 10% profit margin on a project, you would set your price at 110% of your total costs. Another method is to calculate your profit margin as a percentage of cost. For example, if you want to make a 10% profit margin on a project, you would add 11.1% to your total costs.